I can't speak to the value or lack of value of Ray Dalio's principles for running an organization or principles for investing. I think the evidence is in, and his principles for investing are pretty worth paying attention to, as a guy who knows what he's about. But his principles for a changing world order, his sort of intervention into questions of geopolitics, where the world is heading, where the world has been, history, what have you, it's just nonsense. It is not a good book, man.
To understand geopolitics, you must have the freedom to be honest. The More Freedom Foundation podcast. How are you, Rob?
Not bad. I've been enjoying this television show on Netflix. It's The Diplomat, it's called.
I've never heard of it.
Yeah, it's brand new. Kerry Russell, she was on The Americans. And she was sort of in a teen drama. I think she's about my age, which is... so I've watched her for quite some time. But yeah, she's in a Netflix... it's sort of like a... It was interesting reading up on it a little bit and sort of connecting it into my mind to earlier eras of national security television shows like 24 or Homeland. And this sort of seems like the most recent iteration. It seems that the showrunner, I think, seems pretty brilliant, actually used to work on the Homeland and West Wing, what have you. And the idea is that Kerry Russell plays a diplomat who's sort of unwillingly thrown into acting as the UK diplomat, the ambassador, U.S. ambassador to the UK, and there's an international crisis.
Better than the Sudanese ambassador?
Yeah, definitely. There's an international crisis, and it's fun because it's clearly made very contemporaneously or something like that.
Yeah, it's up to date.
Yeah, they talk about Russia in Ukraine, this, that, and the other
Twitters.
thing. It's not a lot of talk about social media or whatnot, but it is just fascinating watching this evolution. You have 24, which is just like the world is full of evil people and we have to brutalize them. Torture is cool and fun and we are proud of it.
Yes.
Because that's what we do because we're hardcore.
Isn't that the one, did he torture someone and pull like their guts out through a towel? Or did he threaten to do that so they would...
It's sad to say. I haven't watched that many episodes of 24 and it's been
I never got
solid
into it.
20 years since I had.
Was it just sort of Muslims are bad?
Yes.
Was that the gist?
Yes. Homeland...
Which is finally moved on.
Well, Homeland was sort of a different, like, post-Iraq thing where we're like, oh, well, we're actually kind of the bad guys sometimes, but really, there's still some bad Muslims out there, and it's important that even though
still haven't moved
even
on.
though we're really fallible, and maybe some of the people who work here are crazy, and this, that, and the other thing.
Maybe destroyed a country or two in this region.
At root, though, in our heart of hearts, America good, Muslims bad. That's what Homeland is. It's sort of more subtly racist than 24 was. And it's okay. I think it bodes well how much I'm enjoying this sort of diplomat television show because it's one of the first of these shows that seems to me to be very much about great power competition. We're no longer in the war on terror era. And all of the production of that era, even the stuff that was supposed to be more sensitive and clever and cynical, it just comes across as racist garbage.
As dated like milk.
Bigoted garbage. But what's interesting about this this sort of diplomat show is that it seems, and actually I think I'm watching some of the later episodes in this first season, and it's drifting a little further away from that. But at least in the early episodes, it's just like the fundamental thing is that great power competition is really stupid. Like that seems to be the message of the show. And it's nice to actually see a show that's like, the global war on terror was incredibly stupid, but it seemed like Hollywood was really committed to pretending that there was something worthwhile going on there. It does seem like with this show, and I've seen some other stuff on Netflix that I've also found pleasantly cynical, or perhaps The Boys on Amazon, which is also sort of an allegory for the military-industrial complex and is quite cynical.
Yeah.
And it's kind of nice to actually see some stuff that it does seem like Hollywood spent about 20 years being sort of shell-shocked and, well, I guess, we got to do our part, and are now like, wait, doing our part is a terrible idea. This is all stupid. And it's nice to watch a television show that sees the world,
I'll have to keep an eye out
that
for it.
sees the world as stupid as I see the world. I mean, it's still fantasy, though. Kerry Russell and some of the people who work with her, have to deal with insane, belligerent American and British politicians, but they're also superheroes, just incredibly competent. And, I'm just going to think of this one thing that...
A bit of a Mary Sue, are they?
And that's all nonsense. That's not how the world really works. But it is nice that the sort of national security television shows are getting closer and closer to the real world as I see it, which is just a hideous comedy. So,
Okay. I went to Belfast to see a very important American Joe.
Oh, yeah?
That's right, Joe Pera.
Joe Pera, who's in it?
Yeah. Oh, he's a comedian. He did a show on, what do you call it, Adult Swim.
Okay.
Joe Pera talks with you, but he basically portrays like an old man energy, even though he's like in his 30s. It's hard to describe, but no, it was brilliant.
Good
I have
stuff.
to say.
Good stuff. You're saying not just Joe Biden goes to Ireland, also
Not just Joe Biden, but he did threaten people with Joe Biden if they were being cheeky to him.
Oh, okay.
I'll bring Joe back, and he'll clog up your town.
You got to look out for that.
That's what he'll do.
Gotta look up. So today, I don't want to talk about Joe Biden. I want to talk about a different.
I want to know what the dealio is with Ray Dalio.
There you go. Well done. That's it. That's a much better segue. I was going to talk about how Joe Biden is a crotchety old man and Ray Dalio is a crotchety old man. So Ray Dalio, brilliant guy, one of the most successful investors of the 20th and 21st centuries, multi-massively billionaire, really big deal. Problem is, he's retired, and he thinks he can start writing books about how the world works.
Oh, he's bored and rich?
Yes, he is both of those things. He is bored and rich and feels like he has great insights to offer the world on history.
That aren't where he made a big pile of money?
Exactly. And I made a video about this about 6 months ago. So he put out this book, which was Ray Dalio's Principles for the Changing World Order. He's put out a series of these principles books, and I can't really vouch to it. I was actually talking to a friend yesterday. I was like, yeah, I haven't worked for anybody in a solid decade now. I haven't been part of like an organization. So I can't speak.
Reporting to HR.
Yes. I can't speak to the value or lack of value of Ray Dalio's principles for running an organization or principles for investing. I think the evidence is in, and his principles for investing are pretty worth paying attention to as a guy who knows what he's about. But his principles for a changing world order, his sort of intervention into questions of geopolitics, where the world is heading, where the world has been, history, what have you, it's just nonsense. It is not a good book, man. It is not a good book. And we've had such success with our Peter Zeihan Debunked. So I thought it might make sense to do a video on Ray Dalio Debunked, since I did the really hideous work of actually reading this entire book.
So has he several books or just the one on world politics?
He's got several books, I think, that cover a range of different things.
But you didn't put yourself through that? You just went with the one?
Oh, Lord, no. I just went with I have no basis, as I said, I have no basis to critique, his principles of human resources or how he ran his company, which I understand is famously a bit cult-like, has 1960s principles of just like extreme criticism all the time. Everything is recorded and everything is analyzed and everybody is supposed to critique everybody.
A little bit like Japanese business culture. No thanks, and it's stay in late and work hard.
Oh, certainly that. But, I mean, that's just American work culture, more broadly, FaceTime. No, this apparently took it to pretty extreme, in more extreme ways, just sort of against hierarchies or what have you. Everybody's supposed to be constantly, you've got a...
striving to be at the top.
Yeah, you have a sort of like annual evaluation in most, I don't know how that works in most European companies, but in the U.S., a lot of companies have like an annual evaluation. It seems like evaluation in Ray Dalio's company was constant or something along those lines. I haven't read the book.
So it was every week instead of once a year?
Or daily. I don't know. I don't know much about his HR principles, but my understanding is it was a little different and a little cult-like, and you cannot argue with the levels of success.
Yeah, with his results.
Yeah, they did incredibly well. It's interesting. There's that television show Billions.
Yeah.
So it's not, I think Billions is based more on Stephen A. Cohen, who's another sort of Connecticut hedge funder, but I think in the show, I've only watched a
little bit of inspiration?
Yes, I think in the show, I've only watched a couple episodes, but that hedge fund is, I think, based in Westport, Connecticut, which is where Ray Dalio's, I've forgotten the name, Harbor View or Harbor something or other, is based. So it's sort of like that level of wealth that we're talking about here. And there's a lot of problems with this book. I mean, first off, it's just barely readable. I really liked, I actually enjoyed the experience, no matter how much I disagreed with it. I enjoyed the experience of reading Peter Zeihan's book. It was sort of, fun and clever.
Well written and thought through.
Yeah, it's fun and clever and has...
And you could see why he's done well with it.
Exactly. It's got, food for thought is presented or whatnot. Ray Dalio doesn't have to write a book that's fun to read because he's Ray effing Dalio.
True. People... some employees will be forced to read this, won't they?
Maybe, but the thing is, people are going to buy it anyway because it's Ray Dalio. It's one of the most successful businessmen in American history, and he's also going to guaranteed to have worshipful coverage everywhere, and that's what he's gotten. Just there's no critical analysis of what one of the...
And I get the feeling a big rebuttal to any criticism is, he really understands the word. Look how much money he's made.
Exactly. So basically it strikes me that nobody really tried. I did a pretty sweeping critique of this about 6 months to a year ago now. Money and Macro, which is a fun YouTube channel that I've been enjoying recently, did a pretty solid critique 4 or 5 months back of Ray Dalio as well. But as far as mainstream coverage, like even the critical reviews were just sort of like, I'm not really sure about this, but just very careful to not be overtly critical. I mean, the book is just terrible. It's an unpleasant reading experience, in part because it's sold as like an easier reading experience. He's like, I'm going to speak in the language of the common man. I'm not going to get into all this weird lingo. So instead, he just makes up his own definitions for lingo.
So it just confuses things. It's like when there's another standard, when they think, this standard will standardize the standards, but then it just adds another standard to a bucket of standards.
So it's an unpleasant book to read, for starters. And I think there is value to the idea sometimes that somebody from the outside can sort of come in and do a better job, but it just doesn't seem like these folks read any history.
Do you think he was too rich and powerful to have an honest editor?
Yes, 100%. 100%. So I looked into it a little bit, and so he got, I think he's stepped back to some degree. Maybe he's an emeritus board chair or something. He's in his late 70s, I think, at his hedge fund. But he has a team at the hedge fund that wrote this book for him. Or with him or what have you. And it's just, a bunch of folks who worked really, really, really hard and put together a bunch of charts, which is what a lot of finance, professional work is. And it's clearly written by a committee that doesn't know anything about history or politics. I think he had some things that he wanted to say, some theses he wanted to get across, and then he had some 20-somethings at the office who put together a manuscript for him that got these ideas across. And I think the big thing that Ray Dalio says is he's big on, I think probably the headline, what folks would go with the most about a year ago when this book was being forced on people, was that Ray Dalio thinks China's time has come. That the Chinese are the future, the U.S. is in decline, China's on the way up. And it's fascinating because it's a lot of sort of, it's really solid conventional wisdom from about 5-10 years ago.
Well, that's what I've noticed. There seems to be a sort of, the veneer of China is peeling off. I see a lot more critique, and even just looking at basic things like their infrastructure and how difficult it is to maintain, and certain things are, being scaled back. We don't seem to see quite the red menace anymore.
Absolutely. Things are moving sort of more in a Peter Zeihan direction. And I think that can be taken too far, I think. I mean, it's still, and I think there's sort of a backlash to the backlash now. It seems like
somewhere in the middle.
Well, it seems like there were just so many disastrous things about China in 2022 that people were like, oh, clearly they're about to fall. And now things aren't looking quite as disastrous in 2023. I think we're talking about how, Saudi Arabia as well has made some course corrections and is not as all-fired, constantly disastrous as it was in, like the 2015 to 2018 period. And that doesn't mean that things are going awesome, but it's not, quite about to collapse. I do believe that Saudi Arabia will collapse. I do not believe that China will collapse. But anyway, yes. So sorry, I'm getting myself off topic. The consensus is that China's coming, and this was what U.S. and world elites believed very fervently back before Ray Dalio retired. So this is still the world that he's mired in, this world that he lives in. And it is really fascinating where that sort of comes from. I found, I always read the front matter of a book. I don't skip the acknowledgments. I don't skip the introduction. It's always important. Every part of a book is important.
Is there for a reason?
Yeah. It tells you more about the book, sometimes inadvertently. And the acknowledgments of this book, which are not in the back, they're in the front because Ray Dalio wanted to do a bunch of name dropping, are just really, really instructive. He talked to a whole bunch of weapons salesmen. He talked to Henry Kissinger. He talked to H.R. McMaster. I can't remember what the other names were, but it's
any Chinese weapons manufacturers or just American ones?
Well, no, so that's the thing. The Americans he spoke to were weapons manufacturers. They are people who want to sell the idea that Russia and China are more powerful, the U.S. is falling behind. And then he talked to a lot of Asian, he was very, very keen to tell us, as I would too as well, that he'd had many conversations with Lee Kuan Yew, the lionized, eulogized, hagiographized, just sainted leader of Singapore for about 50 years, the guy who has sort of set Singapore on its current path, Lee Kuan Yew, I believe of Chinese ancestry, but the Singaporean leader, and spoke to a variety of Chinese academics and Chinese political figures. But what I think this is the fundamental thing, and I talk about this a lot, but it was this Dalio book that really solidified it for me, is that the U.S. mainstream in foreign policy establishment, politics, what have you, and the Chinese mainstream are selling the exact same story for different reasons. But the Chinese want to sell a story of Chinese strength, Chinese rise. They'll emphasize that it's more peaceful and positive for the world than the U.S. weapons salesman will, but it's the same story. Henry Kissinger wants to talk about, he's a little more dovish than a lot of the folks in the U.S. foreign policy establishment on China, or at least has been until recently. But Henry Kissinger, H.R. McMaster, they want to sell you the same story of China's rise.
The Chinese have an aircraft carrier, so they'll be taking Australia soon.
Exactly. That's the vibe. And this is also the case with Russia. This is why everybody was so surprised by how Russia's incredible failures in Ukraine, is because Russia wanted to tell everybody how powerful and scary it was, and the U.S. wanted to jack up those defense budgets and tell everyone how scary they were.
Which has also terrified China because a lot of their weapon systems are based on Russian weapon systems.
Yeah, very good point. This is a problem not just for Ray Dalio, but it is a problem across U.S. and European analysis. It's just this idea that all the money, all the propaganda money is selling the same story for all the even nominally opposing sides, selling the same story of Chinese and Russian strength. And there's just this incredible weakness, and on the acknowledgments page sets the tone for Ray Dalio's book on the changing world order. It's just, he believes that China's going to be a big deal. Something I didn't catch, and Money and Macro, this other YouTube channel, did catch. Watched this just last night, and was really impressed by this. It's just something I feel like I noticed a lot of. If you watch my video on Ray Dalio, I feel like there's a lot of things I noticed that a lot of people missed, but this Money and Macro channel caught something that I missed entirely. which is that Ray Dalio is very concerned to talk about math. He wants to put charts together. He wants to tell a story about how the United States is reaching a level of inequality that has always been problematic for past empires. It's reaching a level of debt that has always been problematic for past empires. And that's sort of the central case that he's making about potential U.S. failure, is that we have these financial metrics that are out of whack and unpleasant, which makes sense. He's a finance guy. This is what he's lived with. He loves numbers. He wants to say these numbers are in a certain way. But what the Money and Macro YouTube channel pointed out was that China's metrics are exactly as bad, if not worse. Their economic inequality metrics are really, really, really terrible. Their debt to GDP ratios are really, really terrible. And that's if you trust the numbers they're putting out.
Because I think most countries massage their figures, but the Chinese seem to give them a little extra massage.
Yeah. And what Money and Macro points out is that this book has lovingly described the precarious financial position that the United States is, with all kinds of graphs. But in their chapters on China, they just don't provide that information.
No.
Because that information...
Oh, yeah, would prove the argument against.
Exactly. Would prove that argument to be nonsense. And he, Money and Macro, I haven't backed this up myself, but he also made a pretty compelling point. So Dalio and his team have put together this whole range of data. The book reads like it was written by a third grader, but like the math behind it, the data. We've got all this stuff we've assembled, but he's sort of, one of the metrics that Dalio likes to talk about is the this metric that they've put together, this measure they put together of divisiveness or polarization within a given country. And Money and Macro points out that so the components of this are like public information surveys, party politics, some other element. All three of these elements are elements that are simply not present in China. Like, of course, they're going to look great on metrics in a country that systematically lies about, their figures, does not have parties to be polarized against each other. It's got one party,
Yeah, or you may lose your kidneys if you disagree.
Yeah. So it's just, just fundamentally unserious. And I think I got at a lot of aspects about why this book was fundamentally unserious in my YouTube video, but I would also highly recommend Money and Macro's critique as well. Because, it was just like the figures...
Blows it out of the water.
It absolutely blows it out of the water. The figures...
It reminds me of when people compare, manufacturing electric cars to petrol cars, but they tend to, go massive into detail on electric cars and then forget massive industries like, how oil's made.
Yeah, but they'll just tell you, oh my God, it's so terrible, all this, you know how much more energy and materials it takes to make an electric car than an internal combustion engine, and that's true. But they just sort of leave out the fact that the internal...
all the production in oil.
There's a component that you have to constantly add to your internal combustion engine.
Or even just make it even. They have a habit of just forgetting certain parts of the car industry for combustion engines.
Yeah.
So if you just leave out the bits about China that don't support your argument.
Yeah. So there's just no one-to...
It's a very scary book.
There's just no one-to-one comparison.
Why do you think he listened to military experts when... I can understand if you were wanting to sell your book as an ordinary Joe Blogs, but he could have interviewed anyone.
Absolutely anybody.
He didn't have to talk to this small, narrow field. And also, he wasn't working on behalf of these people. He's made all the money in the world. He doesn't need to work with them.
Rich people ain't that smart. They are, broadly speaking, I think most rich people inherit, but the folks that become the celebrities, the folks that we know and become celebrated, are incredibly talented, incredibly driven, incredibly focused individuals. And I think we've seen that with Elon Musk most famously over the past 3 years, that once you get them outside of their realm, in which they are incredibly focused and incredibly successful, they can believe and be into some really insane stuff and really bad at things outside of their own realm. And what a distinction between a Ray Dalio, a very 20th century, very not establishment. I mean, he's rebellious in his own way. He really did break the mold in ways, made billions of dollars in very impressive ways, but he's been an established rich guy for half a century now, probably not quite half a century, but 40 years now. And there's a reason why established rich guys, they talk to each other. They have public relations people. They sort of just slot. There's a lot of stuff that they do on autopilot. And when he decided after retiring that, I'm really interested in these geopolitics stuff, I'm going to talk to the people that are just universally recognized as the best people to talk to. And I call them weapons salesmen, but Henry Kissinger is a celebrity, famous foreign policy guy. He's a weapons salesman in function. H.R. McMaster, this is the guy who was much more highly regarded before he became one of Trump's clowns. I think he was the national security advisor for briefly before he got canned. But, these are names that the mainstream media in the United States set up as people that know things, people that know, this is the establishment. So Ray Dalio is impressed with himself that he gets to talk to Henry Kissinger and H.R. McMaster, and he has them on speed dial. So he doesn't even know the landscape to the extent that he would know that, he doesn't have to go out and talk to, dissident weirdos or anything. He could talk to the people at the Quincy Institute, or he could even talk to people at think tanks who actually have a little more nuance on these issues. But no, he thinks he's going to get the real deal. He's going to get the real poop by talking to the people who are in the room where things happen. And the sad fact is the people who are in the rooms where things happen have incredible power, but they don't necessarily know what they're doing. And I think he's just talked, and they believed the BS. Vladimir Putin is incredibly, incredibly powerful. We've talked about this before, but I think part of why he was dumb enough to go into Ukraine is because he believed the BS. He believed his own Kremlin propaganda, and he believed the Pentagon propaganda about how scary he was. He's got his own guys telling him, yeah, we can do this. We're the Red Army. We're the people who won World War II. And then the Pentagon's on the other side being yeah, this guy's scary. These are the guys that won World War II. So he's of course. And we are continuing to learn in Ukraine that the Russian army is not the army that won World War II anymore.
No, definitely not. Well, occasionally they pull out stuff that they did win World War II with.
Oh, just human wave attacks?
Old equipment.
Yeah, old equipment. And and the T-45s or T-52s or whatever. These ancient...
Getting there. And Mosin Nagants and all that.
Sort of ancient weaponry. So I think that's the problem with Ray Dalio, is that he just sort of, I don't think there's really anything that malicious here. I just think that he just sort of assumed that because he could talk to all these people who are, it's a term that I first used with the Bush administration, and these are people who were bureaucratically brilliant. They were people who figured out how to sell stories that got them to be in positions of incredible power. The Bush administration was probably one of the most experienced presidential administrations we have ever had. Colin Powell was, had been running aspects of the U.S. military since Vietnam. Dick Cheney had been a national security advisor he was a chief of staff for Ford, I believe, 30 years prior. Rumsfeld had been in the Congress since the 60s and had been these were incredibly experienced people. But what they knew how to do was how to make a bureaucratic beast jump. They didn't know enough about the world to listen to the literally hundreds of thousands of people who are screaming at them, don't go into Iraq. This is incredibly stupid. So what Ray Dalio has done is he has spoken to a lot of bureaucratically brilliant people who've become household names because of their political savvy and ability to manipulate institutions, who don't really know much about the world. And that's...
So you know how to run a ship incredibly well, but you don't know where's the best place to go to?
Exactly. I think that's a real problem with this book. And it's just, it's a work of fantasy, frankly. There's just such basic promise of this book is that because we've done 1,000 years of data analysis, going back to the Chinese empires. There's a chapter talking about it. The China book nominally starts 5,000 years ago. The start of the China chapter of this book.
So is he sort of implying that it's like the same China's been going for 500 years?
No. So he says that China's had many rises and falls, and I've analyzed all of those. And he's analyzed everything going back. It's basically warmed over, I think it was a Rise and Fall of Great Powers. Is it Paul Kennedy or something? Really like influential book from the 80s, which I've enjoyed. I enjoyed parts of, that sort of attempts to compare and contrast almost exclusively European imperial figures. And then, he brings in Japan and China and whatnot over the past 500 years. And that's clearly, honestly, a lot of it is, there's no actual plagiarism, but sort of the structures.
It's very closely influenced.
And the mental, it's sort of a much, much dumber version. It's like 2 years back, AI ripoff of Paul Kennedy is what is the most charitable way that this Ray Dalio book could be described. It's just ridiculous. I analyzed in depth in my video the history that it conveys of the Dutch Republic. He presents this world where the American Empire is what's in charge. Before it was the British Empire, which is true. I would agree with that, as everyone who's paid any attention to my content well knows. And before that was the Dutch Empire, and I'm just like, no, it effing wasn't.
But you're from New Amsterdam.
Yeah. It just, man. But yeah, so essentially he just incredibly manipulates. He builds his model of how empires rise and fall off the rise and fall of the British Empire, which I think is a perfectly defensible thing to do. And then he just pretends that all manner of empires before that in entirely different eras and approaches to things are exactly the same thing. There's this ridiculous passage. I reproduced it in the video entirely, just that whole page, because I didn't want to misconstrue him, but my reading of the paragraph that he's is essentially that Rome wouldn't have fell if they had figured out their interest rate policy. It's just there
wasn't a slow decline over hundreds of years.
But
it was just the interest rate.
It just Rome didn't have an effing central bank. It's just because central banks were invented in the past 150 years. Yes, the Bank of England goes back a little further, but what a central bank is in Ray Dalio's imagination is something that was established in the New Deal. In a human lifetime ago.
Yeah.
Rome didn't fall because it's interest rates. That I could be misconstruing this passage. I put it in the video, but there's just a real deep-dyed ignorance of how the world has functioned. And I think he thought that he could convey the world this way because this is the way that Henry Kissinger talks about the world. Henry Kissinger is very big on diplomatic history, or I don't know if that was the specific connection, but it's just there's a really high level of ignorance of historical processes in the halls where the decisions get made. And Ray Dalio thought he could build an understanding of the world mostly by talking to people where the decisions got made, put together some theses, and then have a bunch of 20-somethings at Fartwater or whatever his hedge fund's name was, put together a book about it. And it is not an impressive effort.
Do you see any political or potential risks or consequences if, a lot of people were to believe this book?
Well, I think it kind of, I certainly haven't seen anybody talking about it over the past 6 months after the big public relations push. I think that it's so transparently useless that I think that a lot of people had to respectfully review it, and I read a lot of those reviews. They had to respectfully review it because their bosses have cocktails at the Dalio's house,
Are there companies owned by them somehow?
Yeah, the board shares or what have you. But it just the gritted teeth through which serious reviewers were sort of reviewing this. This isn't exactly how I'd go about this. This doesn't seem entirely on point or working with my understanding of how the world effing works. But just very, very scrupulously polite. But yeah, I don't think anybody's basing anything serious off of this. It's just sort of it was a TikTok phenomenon. I think it really appeals to a lot of crypto people, or did appeal to a lot of crypto people, because it told a lot of really satisfying stories that make sense with the hyper-libertarian DNA behind a lot of crypto thought. Just this idea that the dollar, they're printing too much. And to be clear, I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that the predictions of catastrophe because of this money printing are essentially 50 years old at this point. And catastrophe has yet to crop up. I think it's entirely possible that we will get catastrophe. But the idea that you can like make concrete predictions based on this idea that, yeah, our fiscal stuff doesn't make any sense, or that you could know that like Bitcoin's going to go to the roof, 6 months from now because the dollar is going to fall. I think this was very appealing to a lot of crypto folks who've over the past 5-10 years started thinking about macro finance, started thinking about reserve currencies, that sort of thing. It's the this is definitely a book that prioritizes reserve currencies and talks about how important that is. One of the reasons that his history of the Dutch Republic is so distortionary, that's not a word, is so distorted.
It is now.
Okay, good, we've coined it. One of the reasons his history of the Dutch Republic is so distorted is because the Dutch currency was of serious world significance for about 100 years after the Dutch Empire was. But because currency is all that matters in Dalio's vision of the world, he pretends that the Dutch Empire was very powerful, or even not a world hegemon, but like was a superpower for 100 years after it actually was, because the currency was still important. So like that emphasis on currency, this is something that a lot of crypto folks have just sort of discovered over the past 5-10 years to sort of provide a good narrative for how they became so inexplicably rich. So they've really, really gone for, in a big way, every new re-expression of these very old ideas about we shouldn't print so much money, we shouldn't have gotten off the gold standard. Dalio doesn't go quite that far. He doesn't say that we shouldn't have gone off the gold standard, but he does say that he implies, is my read of this could be unfair, my implication is, my read of his implication is that as soon as we got off the gold standard, we put ourselves in a position where we would inevitably collapse. Like it was just sort of like it's gonna happen or what have you. So I think for a lot of crypto people, they're like facing these arguments for the first time, and they're like, yeah, that sounds right. We shouldn't print all this money. We're gonna kill the dollar. The dollar's going away tomorrow, because they've just started paying attention over the past 5-10 years. I was a fervent believer in those sorts of things. During the Obama administration, I thought that stimulus and I thought that quantitative easing was going to tank everything, because I believed people like Ray Dalio or other economists, he's not an economist, but I believed establishment economists, I believed right-leaning economists and finance people like Ray Dalio, a finance person. I think he wouldn't want to describe himself as right-leaning, but he's a rich dude who doesn't like taxes. I believed those folks in 2008, where I was like, oh my God, we've made it over $10 trillion in debt. We're about to fall apart. Well, now we're at like $26 trillion in debt. And 15 years after 2008, the broad consensus is actually that Obama really should have spent a lot more money, and maybe we'd have a better world if he had done so. Because in 2020, even before 2020, Donald Trump came to power and just spent like a drunken sailor to little real negative consequences for the U.S. and world economy. And then COVID came along and just the balance sheet.
The taps opened up.
Yeah, yeah. And now, I think perhaps one reason why we haven't heard so much about this Dalio World Order book is that there's this sort of assumption, which also suffused a lot of crypto thinking circa 2020, 2021, which was that, the Fed can never hike rates. The Fed is never going to be able to raise rates. And then in March of 2022, the Fed started one of the most historically consequential rate hiking experiments we've ever seen. And despite some bank failures a month or so back, which we talked about, we're all still here.
Oh, yeah. Things seem to have calmed down.
Yeah. And I think it's entirely possible. I read some credible doomsaying that, actually, the bottom's going to drop out of the economy, and then the Fed's going to crash down to 0% interest rates again. And then maybe sort of Ray Dalio and certain crypto critiques will seem I don't know about come true, but they'll seem more attractive again. But I think in the world over the past year or so, this sort of crypto Ray Dalio world where the U.S. is on this irreversible path of decline, where money's always easy, and things are just going to get more and more ridiculous and hyperinflated, I think that's been contradicted to some degree.
What do you think he gets wrong the most?
Well, the history is most irritating to me, obviously, because I'm a big history nerd.
Because the Dutch were never more powerful than the British.
The Dutch were extraordinarily powerful for like a couple decades there because they figured out a lot of things that the British ripped off. But the Dutch didn't have a private island. Sorry to the Scots and the Welsh, but the English had had the capacity to set up a level of security and a level of population that the Dutch could never manage. So the Dutch, in their process of their sort of 80 years war of independence against the Spanish, were able to set up a range of financial and military institutions and political institutions, frankly. It was the Dutch Republic for a very long time when the republics were a little thin on the ground. This is sort of from the late 1500s until just about the middle of the 1600s. And this War of Independence was sort of the Dutch Golden Age. You've got Rembrandt, you got all kinds of wealth, and they really truly were, and they figured out aspects of world empire building, joint stock companies, what have you, that were novel and were impressive. And I think you can, in the 1610s, 1620s, 1630s, you can talk about the Dutch as a sort of superpower, one of competing superpowers, and the most impressive world power, sure, by far. The problem is that they were in such a perilous geopolitical position within Europe that the French conquered them a couple times, the British kicked the French, worked with the Dutch to kick them out, but then actually the Dutch, there were 3 Anglo-Dutch wars. I think 2 of them were in the 1600s, one of them might have been, one of them was in the 1700s, which eventually just sort of, it's actually kind of like the Punic Wars. It was one about 100 years later where the British just squashed what was left of the Dutch Republic like a bug and helped install, I'm confusing, there's some French Revolution stuff in there as well. But regardless, in 2 Anglo-Dutch wars in the 1600s, the British, who had already adopted a lot of these imperial models that the Dutch had,
something like banking the Dutch did invent, and then the British says, that's a lovely idea.
I think it's this oversimplifies things, but
definitely.
Amsterdam, or actually I think it was Antwerp, which was sort of the part of the Netherlands that the Spanish took. I could talk about this for a full podcast, but I'm debating how far to get into the weeds here. But the Dutch Republic was sort of the Protestants who lived in the Netherlands, took the financial innovations of Antwerp, brought them to Amsterdam. Then you've got that Dutch Golden Age. One of those is the idea of a centralized stock market, or bourse. That's an incredibly different animal from the stock market of today, but that's sort of the centralized trading of shares, joint stock companies. I believe it already existed, but that they really moved things forward, a number of things forward. And then in these 2 1600s Anglo-Dutch wars, the British just carved off the most valuable bits of the Dutch Empire. Eventually, actually, the Dutch and the British spent the next century as sort of allies, but this was after the British had mostly displaced the Dutch. So the Dutch were a very, very big deal, very impressive group for the first half of the 1600s. And then the British took what was best about their empire, consolidated it, grew it, and eventually put together the first world system in the 1750s. And that's sort of my main irritation about the theme of both this ridiculous book of Ray Dalio's, but also much more serious efforts like The Rise and Fall of Great Powers by Paul Kennedy, which presumed to compare the British and American empires to anything else that came before it. It's just simply not. It just doesn't make sense. I think I put this if I toot my own horn, I think I put this in a fairly clever way in the video. It's, the Dutch And the Romans, from the Romans 2,000 years ago to the Dutch 400 years ago, yes, there's some real similarities about, stabbing somebody at the outskirts of their border forts. There's some quite similarity there. There's tremendous amount of difference from what the American Empire can definitely do, and the British Empire was able to do to a degree, which is, over lunch in New York City, a couple of bankers can decide to completely destroy the finances of an entire nation, and do so regularly. Utterly destroy is a capacity they have, but certainly dramatically impact. So it's just a fundamentally different animal. The British Empire and the U.S. Empire are fundamentally different animals from anything that came before. And I've written a book, and I believe there is real value in comparing the U.S. and British empires. But this idea, which Ray Dalio sells, despite the fact that his model is almost entirely just the British Empire and nothing else fits into it, sells this idea that I've studied thousands of years of history, and this is how this system was generated from thousands of years of history, and this is what happens. And it's just, you're just not, it's fantasy. It's like, it's sub a role-playing game. It is not, there are too many data points involved.
It reminds me of what a lot of economists do. An economist I'm fond of is Dave McWilliams, and he says what they'll do is they'll make a really lovely model. It's a beautiful model. And then it works for some things, so they kind of get a bit too up of themselves. So if they apply it to a country and it doesn't work, the model's not wrong, because it couldn't be wrong. It's the people that are wrong. So quite often countries implement horrible policies trying to make a model work that just isn't accurate enough to reflect the entire real world.
Absolutely.
And it seems like this is something he's doing. He's fudging his own model and trying to make it fit the world when, it's just not right.
Yeah, he's trying to make the world fit his model, and it just doesn't make any sense. There's this, I think it's Angus Madison was the famous economist, maybe some point in the 20th century, who put together a lot of these figures, these historical GDP figures. And I think they're brilliant. I think it's fascinating. I think it's a really fun thing to do. It's a great thought experiment to how did the GDP of ancient Rome compare to 1500s France, compare to France in the 1940s? But you have to understand, this is a thought experiment.
Oh yeah.
This is, and I am certain that Madison, or I think it was, I could be entirely wrong about that. I hope I'm not. I think it's Madison is definitely the last name of this guy, and I'm sure he presented this with here is a massive grain of salt with which to take this. I don't know. This is just a
bit of fun.
Wholly theoretical. I'm making all kinds of absurd assumptions, this, that, and the other thing, but any kind of data we want to collect before 1800 anywhere is, with the exception of a few data sets of London, essentially.
Oh yeah, ancient Egypt.
Or yeah, there are interesting things that we've managed to put together, but weird moments that we've gotten a better picture.
Oh
of.
yeah, wee tiny glimmers in the dark.
Exactly. So but trying to put together extraordinary arrogance of trying to put together a book that's I've distilled the lessons of thousands of years of history, and it's based on numbers. It's just you don't have the data, man. We don't have the data before 1800 for any country. And it's, yeah. I think I've made it clear. I feel kind of bad because Ray Dalio does seem he seems like a decent sort who's trying to use his retirement.
As far as a billionaire goes, he seems not the worst.
As far as a billionaire goes, he seems like a decent sort who's trying to use his retirement for positive things. But yeah, it's not a good book.
What does the book get right? Since we've focused on so much negativity, what did you like about it?
I thought its coverage of the British Empire was kind of interesting, and I think some of its data sets from the British Empire were also, probably a bit fantastical in conjecture, but they are interesting, and I think eventually, when I finally finish my American Empire book and hopefully do another project in between, I will return to British Empire stuff, and I think the 40 pages or so that he wrote on the British Empire and that collected data sets around the British Empire, I think those 40 pages might be useful to me when I revisit
Yoink.
the British Empire at some point. Probably in my mid-50s at this point. But that was actually kind of useful. It does seem like, because the entire model is just basically the history. He posits in a popular YouTube video as well, he sort of talks about, this is my grand model of what happens to every empire, and it's exclusively what happened to the British Empire.
Does he talk about Egypt much?
No.
It's just because it's, 4,000 years? Like, it seems like it's an empire that
No, he doesn't even...
isn't talked about enough. Like, America could be Egypt.
Well, that would be interesting. The idea that the United States could last
Millennia.
thousands of years. I have not spent enough time looking at Egypt myself, but like with a cursory examination, it is important, like that Egypt, much like China, you can talk about 5,000 years of Chinese history, or you can certainly talk about 5,000 years of Egyptian history, but these were very, very, very different
night
models.
and day.
And there's, don't get me wrong, there's incredible consistency and incredible stasis in some of the iconography and approaches, but they were very different dynasties, very different approaches to things. The United States could, something called the United States could be around 3,000 years from now, but it'll be a very different thing. Very different thing. I had a recent conversation with one of these sort of tech AI millennium is coming people, and better informed than most of the people I see on TikTok.
Okay.
And it's kind of fascinating.
While you still can use TikTok?
Yes, well, I still can. Use the TikTok. But no, it was like a one-on-one conversation, and it is interesting. He seemed very disturbed, frankly, about like what AI was going to bring, and I think that will.
Oh yeah, it's going to be absolute carnage for the workplace.
Yeah. For the work.
A lot of like email jobs, or either you're just going to be expected to do 10 times, 100 times more, or you won't be employed.
Yeah, I think that's very true. So it's going to be carnage in the workplace,
and any of the arts, I think, are in trouble.
Yeah, it's just
and a lot of people doing very basic journalism.
It's going to change human experience in fairly serious ways. I think the general we're going to create our masters. I don't put much credence in that.
The real worry is scammers.
Yeah, exactly.
Apparently, if anyone rings and they don't say anything, just hang up, because they can model your voice.
Oh dear.
And then use an AI to then phone your relatives.
Jesus.
With a ransom.
That's not
and
good.
Say, oh, Rob's been kidnapped. We need money, blah, blah. Or, oh, I'm in trouble. Send money.
Jesus.
So, yeah. Oh, no. There's going to be it's going to be great for scammers.
That's really unpleasant.
Like, it's going to be used as a tool. It's not going to be the AI self-aware and wants to kill us all.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, there's plenty of scope for complete disruption of everything about human society long before we invent Skynet.
And so we don't need to worry about the Chinese.
Maybe. Who knows?
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, the Chinese might... everyone was very convinced that the Chinese were going to clean our clocks in AI about 2 years ago because of the data sets that they have access to and the lack of privacy protections. The idea was that they were just going to... Because they were just going to kick our asses, but it seems to be the same Silicon Valley folks who seem to be leading the charge on a lot of these technologies.
But do you think it's possible America has access to those data sets, even if the Chinese aren't aware?
Well, I don't know, but I couldn't speak to the intricacies of how OpenAI interacts with the U.S. government on. That would be kind of fascinating, actually. Yeah, just simply. Because
I sometimes think they're just sort of almost working. They're unaware that they're just helping America, because America may be able to get access to these and then have immense information on China.
Yeah, another interesting aspect of the conversation. Aren't you worried that we're just going to have a whole bunch of like hamster wheel jobs? He asked me. He's like, well, so what happens in a world where scarcity goes away, where all of our material needs are handled? And I was like, well, that happened 100 years ago. You just invent hamster wheels for people. You come up with, and I don't think that's something that...
Or Kelvin said to bury money and then pay people, or then people dig it up.
Yeah. Is that Kelvin or Keynes? But yeah.
If you enjoyed reading this book or didn't enjoy it, what would you recommend instead of?
I would recommend Paul Kennedy's Rise and Fall of Great Powers. That is a classic. It's, of course, kind of amusing because it's written in the 1980s, so Japan is going to take over everything, and China is just sort of this minor curiosity. So it is a very intelligent, well-reasoned book, but we are all at the mercy of the fashions of a given era.
And our data sets.
Yes, and our data sets. But that's a fascinating book. Ian Morris is I think California. I mean, he might be British in origin, but I think he's a California-based academic. Has written a series of books. I really enjoyed Why the West Rules for Now or something. Thought was very clever and is an attempt to do very similar work to what Ray Dalio did, but with a lot more care and restraint. I actually got very angry at Ian Morris. He wrote a follow-up book about sort of the utility of war that was, again, you get a guy outside of the things that they actually know, and he just sort of ended with this very standard, like, we're going to go to war with China, and that's good. And I'm just like, and war is inevitable, and we should give as much money as possible to the Pentagon. I'm just like, damn, man, like, that is... You just have no idea how the world works, but he knows a lot about how history has worked. And he's actually put together some data sets and attempted to quantify some of that long reach of Chinese versus U.S. Competition. So, and I think Ian Morris actually gets thanked in the acknowledgments, now that I recall, of this Ray Dalio book. But that is a much, much better version of this, and it doesn't attempt to make these sort of extraordinary claims on the basis of not very strong information. So it's a much more careful and much more interesting book. It's been a decade since I read it, but I enjoyed that, and I think that was a similar and much better version of this. And if you really want to dive in on American Empire versus British Empire, you should definitely check out Avoiding the British Empire, a book by this crazy guy named Rob Morris.
And how America can avoid the mistakes of the first global empire.
There you go. Yes, thank you, Rory. Thank you.
And that was the Dealio with Ray Dalio.
All right, man. Okay. Thanks, folks.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.